At first, no one dared speak of it aloud, the way his steps had softened, his appetite had shrunk, or how his voice, once sonorous and sharp, had turned raspy and winded. The courtiers clung to denial like dying men to drifting wood, terrified to admit that France's eternal sun was setting. Behind the silk-paneled walls of Versailles, whispers bloomed like mold. The king's face had changed, they said. His once immaculate teeth had rotted away, his breath foul even from a distance. Some nights, muffled groans leaked through the corridors, but still the servants bowed and smiled, still the dukes and bishops kissed his hands, pretending not to feel the tremble beneath his skin. By now, he was already a relic, not a man but a myth, imprisoned in velvet, and myths, as history proves, rot slower than flesh. In truth, Louis XIV had become a prisoner of the world he built. Versailles, with its marble grandeur and gold-encrusted halls, had been born of his will and vanity, but now it trapped him. The mirrors that once reflected divine magnificence now stared back with a cruel honesty. The king was aging, and worse, he was dying, slowly and without dignity. The first true sign of decay came not with a bang, but with a limp, a subtle ache in the left leg, which the king dismissed as nothing more than stiffness, something to be walked off. But the pain grew. It swelled and sharpened. Within days he was unable to walk without support. Within weeks, even the pressure of bed linens caused him to wince. Physicians, those polished sorcerers of the French court, crowded around him with leeches, potions, and prayers. Purpose created this, Louitia. They offered comfort in the form of rituals rather than results. One ordered the leg to be rubbed with wine and spices. Another suggested cutting open the foot to drain imaginary poisons. But behind their scholarly facades, none of them could disguise the truth. They were terrified. What bloomed beneath the king's skin was not an ailment that could be healed. It was gangrene, ravenous and irreversible. Flesh was dying while the man still breathed. The scent was the first thing they noticed. Sweet and rotting, it crept through the bedchamber like a phantom. The king's valet, who had once stood proudly beside him as he dressed in silks and diamonds, now struggled to suppress his gagging. Louis, now 76, had outlived his own strength. His body had become a battlefield of decay. The leg turning a deep bruised black, then green, then the color of ash. Open sores wept onto the sheets. Maggots were whispered of in the halls, but never spoken of openly. To say the king was dying was treason. To notice he was rotting alive was blasphemy. Versailles still performed its rituals. Courtiers still gathered to watch him rise, even when he could no longer sit upright. They watched him eat, though every swallow was pain. They listened to him speak, though his words slurred through a mouth now missing half its teeth. The monarch who once bent nations now could not command his own bowels. Still, he clung to ceremony. He insisted on appearing in public, draped in gold, even as pus soaked through the linen beneath. A man whose every gesture had once inspired imitation was now a grotesque reflection of mortality. One day, as he attempted to stand, he collapsed in a heap, the leg too ravaged to support him. A foul fluid burst through the bandages, splattering across the ornate carpet. The room froze. For a moment no one moved. Then, as if the fabric of illusion could still be salvaged, the kinglet announced the king had merely misstepped. But everyone in that room understood. The Sun King was dying from the inside out. Desperate, the physicians begged him to allow amputation. They argued that cutting off the leg might buy him a few more months, perhaps even a year. But Louis refused. He was not a common man to be carved like meat. He would die whole, he said, and he would die as king. So they watched as the infection spread, inch by inch. The leg began to emit a sound, a subtle crackling as if the tissue itself was collapsing inward. By now, his groans echoed nightly. The palace was filled with the scent of death, sweet and bitter and relentless. Servants took to placing flowers near the doorway, not to mask the odor, but to disguise it with a scent the brain might accept. Nothing worked. Versailles, once the heartbeat of Europe, now throbbed with dread. Louis had always believed in divine right, that his body was chosen by God to rule. Now that same body betrayed him, and with it the illusion of immortality collapsed. Behind his eyes, in moments of lucidity, one wonders if he saw the truth, that he was no more divine than the beggars on the street, and that death made kings and paupers equal in the end. His dreams turned feverish. He cried out for long-dead friends, mistook shadows for his mother, and accused walls of whispering his sins back to him. And still Versailles performed. They washed him, perfumed him, powdered his cheeks. They read him scripture and letters from foreign courts. They kissed his blistered hands and declared him strong. They called him eternal, even as his body liquefied beneath the sheets. In the final days, the king summoned his descendants. His great-grandson, barely a child, was brought before him. With a hand like wax, Louis touched the boy's head and muttered his last decree. I am leaving, but the state remains. It was the final act of a lifelong performance. Moments later, his eyes dimmed, the breath faltered, and the Sun King, radiant symbol of God on earth, died in silence, surrounded not by trumpets, but by the smell of rotting flesh and fading gold. He had ruled for 72 years, outlived his sons, outlasted empires, and yet, in the end, he died, as all men do, helpless, in pain, and alone. But the story doesn't end here, for death does not erase the echoes of a life like Louis XIV's. It magnifies them. The palace that once worshipped his presence now struggled with his legacy. Versailles became a mausoleum of ambition, its marble corridors still whispering the secrets of a man who had made himself God and died a slave to his own myth. Historians would later call his final months a cautionary tale, not of mortality, but of illusion, of the dangers of worshipping image over truth, performance over purpose, and of what happens when power forgets that even the brightest suns must one day set. The body of Louis XIV did not rest easily. Within hours of his death, the grand machinery of royal mourning surged into motion, an opulent performance choreographed down to the flicker of candlelight. Versailles became a theater of grief, not for the man, but for the monarchy he embodied. Draped in black velvet, courtiers wept beneath gilded ceilings, their sobs more ceremonial than sincere. Trumpets groaned through the hall, priests muttered Latin over incense-thickened air. Outside, the public was informed with carefully chosen words. The Sun King had passed on, but the light of France would endure. But behind closed doors, the truth festered. The king's corpse, bloated, stiff, and putrid, was already becoming a problem. Embalming was attempted, of course. The surgeons sliced open the royal abdomen with trembling hands, releasing a stench so overwhelming it drove grown men to vomit. The internal organs, once considered sacred vessels of divine rule, were now blackened masses of rot. They removed what they could, stuffing the body with herbs and perfumed cloth, sealing it in layers of wax and linen, but nothing could mask what had already begun. Louis was decomposing faster than expected, and in a palace obsessed with appearance, decay was treasonous. As tradition dictated, the corpse was placed in a gilded coffin and paraded through Versailles for the final viewing. Nobles lined up to pay their respects, but many recoiled in horror. The king's face had collapsed inward. The skin, drawn taut in life by powders and pride, now hung in leathery folds. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, had turned glassy, his mouth twisted into something between a scream and a grin. Some whispered he looked like a wax figure left too long in the sun. Others said he looked like a warning, but all agreed This was no longer the Sun King. This was a man who had burned too long and too bright, and whose remains now mocked the myth he had once been. The procession to Saint-Denis, the final resting place of French royalty, was both sacred and grotesque. The funeral carriage, covered in obsidian drapes and pulled by pale horses, creaked along the cobbled roads like a hearse from a nightmare. The people gathered in silence. Some wept. Others watched coldly, remembering the wars, the taxes, the years of famine, while Versailles danced. One man in the crowd was overheard muttering, "Let him be judged by a power greater than his own." At night, rumors spread that dogs followed the carriage, drawn by the smell. At Saint-Denis, the burial rites were executed with ritualistic precision. The heart was removed and placed in a silver urn, the entrails buried separately. The body, now barely holding together, was lowered into the royal crypt with prayers and proclamations. But beneath the chanting there was fear. Fear not just of death, but of what Louis had left behind. His reign had reshaped France, in law, culture, architecture, and ego, and the void he left was immense, terrifying and unstable. The country was broke, the people were angry, his heir was a 5-year-old child, and Versailles, that shimmering jewel of absolute monarchy, had become a haunted palace. In the days after the funeral, a peculiar chill settled over the halls. Servants swore they heard footsteps where none walked. The king's private chambers were sealed, yet candles burned low as if recently snuffed. Portraits of the monarch seemed to glare with disapproval. Some claimed to see his reflection in mirrors that should have been empty. Whether ghost or guilt, Louis XIV lingered, not in flesh, but in atmosphere. The rituals of power he created continued, but without their puppet master, they felt hollow, even absurd. Ministers, once obsessed with his opinion, now argued amongst themselves, clinging to fragments of a fallen world. And then the rumors began, not just of spirits, but of secrets, hidden letters, sealed rooms, forgotten passages beneath the palace. Some believed Louis had kept more than wealth and mistresses in Versailles, that somewhere within its miles of corridors he had locked away truths too dangerous for daylight. A few even suggested his physicians had lied, that the infection had not been natural, that someone close to the king had hastened his death. Poison, perhaps. A conspiracy born not from hatred, but from mercy. For how else could one explain the pace of his decay, the agony he endured? The royal doctors, long since dead themselves, never confessed, but their notes, when examined centuries later, revealed inconsistencies. Medications administered in odd doses, symptoms described with strange vagueness. In the most damning detail, a prescription for a substance no longer found in modern records, its name redacted, its purpose unknown. Perhaps the truth will never be known. Perhaps the death of Louis XIV was the natural conclusion to an unnatural life. A man who believed himself divine, now rotted like any other. But the symbolism was too rich to ignore. His demise mirrored the decline of the world he had ruled. The grandeur, the artifice, the absolute control, all collapsing into the soil along with his bones. And as France stumbled toward revolution over the next century, people would look back at his reign not as a golden age, but as the beginning of the end, a slow poison that took generations to kill. The boy who inherited his throne, Louis XV, grew up under the weight of a shadow so vast it nearly smothered him. He was told to imitate the Sun King, to honor his memory, to govern like a god. But how do you live up to a corpse that still commands a palace? How do you rule a country that only pretends to mourn? Even as France dressed itself in black, it was already preparing to tear off the costume. The Enlightenment was rising. Ideas were spreading. The people had seen too much, suffered too long, and Versailles, that marble temple to vanity, was now a monument to warning. Still, the myth endured. Even today, school children learn of Louis Fermont, as the king who brought glory to France. They memorize his victories, his palaces, his legacy, but they don't often hear of the smell, of the screams, of the way his body collapsed in on itself while the world bowed in denial. They don't teach how power, left unchecked, devours itself, or how even a man worshipped as the sun can die shivering in the dark. And yet, the story of Louis XV refuses to end with the sealing of his tomb, for what he left behind was not just a decaying body or a grieving court. It was a living machine of control, ritual, and illusion that refused to shut down. Versailles remained, vast and humming with ceremonial precision, a monument not to the man, but to the myth he constructed. The courtiers kept their powdered wigs, the ministers recited their memorized lines, and the young Louis XIV was placed on a throne far too large for his body. But something had shifted, a subtle crack in the facade, an unease that no amount of marble or music could hide, because when a god dies, it leaves a silence too loud to ignore. In the years that followed, the kingdom tried desperately to maintain the illusion of divine rule, but the memory of the Sun King's grotesque demise clung to Versailles like smoke. His bedroom, once the center of the universe, was now visited with hushed reverence, and some say dread. Servants swore they could still hear his wheezing in the dead of night, the sound of sheets rustling, the soft creak of a slippered step. The tapestries he'd once chosen himself seemed to age faster than the rest of the palace, their vibrant colors fading into a sickly pallor. The gilded moldings above his deathbed darkened inexplicably, and no amount of polish could make them shine again. And there was something else, a series of sealed letters, locked away in the royal archives, which had been marked with a symbol only the king himself had used. A blazing sun scratched over with a single diagonal stroke. It was not until decades later, long after Louis XV had grown into a timid and passive king, that a historian gained access. The contents were startling. Private confessions, observations of decline, dreams filled with dread, warnings. In one, the dying Louis admitted that he no longer believed God had chosen him, but rather that he had chosen God, dressed himself in divinity like a costume, and worn it for so long that even he had forgotten the truth. Another letter described a recurring vision, his own corpse, dressed in gold, crawling across the floors of Versailles, whispering, "Remember me," into the ears of every sleeping noble. Some dismissed the writings as the ramblings of a fevered mind. Others, though, began to see the letters as something far more chilling, a prophecy. For just as Louis had feared, his legacy was not a stable one. The rituals he had perfected were now empty habits. The monarchs who followed him were shadows, performing roles in a collapsing theater. And the people, once too frightened to question the king's divinity, had begun to whisper. In taverns, in brothels, in coffee houses, lit by enlightenment fire, they spoke of freedom, of reason, of equality. What Louis had built as a fortress of divine power was becoming a tomb of hypocrisy. The same palace that had once commanded awe now inspired resentment. Where once there had been worship, there was now rot. And beneath it all, the memory of his death remained, not as tragedy, but as symbol. Artists began to paint darker portraits of the Sun King, his face twisted in agony, his golden robes trailing smoke. Playwrights and poets turned his final days into metaphors for the decay of monarchy itself. In the court, no one dared criticize him publicly, but in the salons of Paris, he was dissected like a corpse on a table. Every contradiction of his reign was exposed. His obsession with God, yet his cruelty to the poor. His love of beauty built on blood and war. His belief in order, even as chaos bred beneath his throne. As the years passed, France's wounds deepened, famines came, and Louis XV turned his face away. Taxes rose and the nobility feasted. Revolution stirred like a monster beneath the floorboards. By the time Louis XVI inherited the throne, the machine was too rusted to move. Versailles, still grand, now felt like a mausoleum, haunted not by ghosts, but by history's judgment. And when the revolution finally erupted, it came not as a storm, but as a reckoning centuries in the making. The guillotine was not just an instrument of death, it was a symbol of purification, a rejection of centuries of rot. And when Louis XVI, the great-grandson of the Sun King, was led to the scaffold, the people did not just cheer for justice, they cheered for exorcism. In that moment, it was not one king who died, but all kings, a severing of the illusion that bloodlines could divine authority. And somewhere, perhaps in the darkest corners of Versailles, the echoes of Louis XIV's final breath twisted into something like laughter, not of joy but of recognition. The end he feared had come to pass. The power he had wrapped in gold had become a shroud. Today, tourists wander through the Hall of Mirrors, marveling at its splendor, photographing its light. But few stop to consider what that light hides, the shadows it was built to blind. They do not see the sweat on the servants who polished the floors, the bodies broken to mine the stone, the lives lost in the wars that paid for the ceiling's gilding. They do not smell the decay. They do not hear the whispers, but they are there, if you know how to listen. For Louis XIV did not die when his breath stopped. He died slowly, piece by piece, as the weight of his myth collapsed inward. He died in the screams of the peasants. He died in the debt ledger. He died every time a courtier bowed without faith. And his final lesson, unspoken but carved into the bones of France, was this: the sun may rise by its own will, but it sets under the laws of time. No man escapes decay, not even kings, especially not kings. And so history does not remember Louis XIV as a god, though he tried. It remembers him as a mirror, one that shows us how power, once untethered from humanity, becomes its own disease, how illusion, left unchecked, becomes infection, and how the brightest lights cast the longest, darkest shadows.